So thank you everyone for watching yet another episode in which I talk about issues related to public transport. Our topic for today is going to be the issue of through running. So what is through running? It is, in this context, something that is always about commuter rail of various kinds. So let's look at what is, I think, the most visually distinctive example. Not the earliest, among the world's largest, not quite the largest, that would be Tokyo, but the most visually distinct on a map, and that is Tokyo. Sorry, Tokyo is the largest. Paris is the one that is most visually distinct. And why is it visually distinct? Just because of how Google depicts railways. It is much easier to depict mainline railways than urban rail tunnels. So you can maybe see a little bit of black for the metro lines, but your eyes will be drawn to the main lines. So let's discuss the situation in Paris before through running. Through running just means you run the commuter lines through the city rather than terminating in the city. So the non-through running lines in Paris until the 1970s, these would be all the lines in Paris. They went to historic terminals that were built in the middle of the 19th century at or near the edge of the built-up area of town. Why? Because steam trains require a lot of urban space for their stations. To some extent, even modern trains do when it's a terminal. And this means that you need to either demolish a lot of property to do that, or terminate. So I promised I would talk about Paris because visual distinction, but London actually has a specific visually distinct thing that I would like to highlight. London has a little bit of through running, mainly, for example, Crossrail, which I have an older video about from about a month ago. So I would like to point out something about London, that you see all these big railway terminals. So this is Euston, St. Pancras, King's Cross. These are pretty big yards, and historically they were even bigger for goods yards and for servicing of steam locomotives. So you needed to demolish. So think about it. They had to demolish stuff this size to build this train terminal. So maybe they could only go about as far as Euston Road here. And maybe it was easier to penetrate in a poorer area. So in South London and East London, the railway terminals are all much closer to city center. So Fenchurch Street is within the City of London, Liverpool Street. London Bridge is not. It's across the river, but it's very close as well. Waterloo is fairly close as well, and all of this is because this was where the poor people lived. This was where the rich people lived, so penetration was much harder. So in Paris, at any rate, there were similar issues, and maybe you could use some right of way to get in, but even that was difficult. So maybe you could string your way up until here to get to Gare d'Austerlitz, and then in 1900 they electrified the regional lines out of this, so they could even build a smaller railway line that penetrated much further. It was electric and not steam, so it didn't require as much property demolition. As much property demolition. No, not it's not about Crossrail. I'm probably never going to mention London. I'm probably never going to talk much about London again this stream. It's about through running and why you do it. But I need to explain the history of this to explain why it's useful. And so the penetration went all the way until here, so right now it's a museum because of the through running, but it used to be a train station, Gare d'Orsay. And likewise, there was a lot of penetration, again, with electrification of this line. This was a little commuter line called Ligne de Sceaux. It never became an important, it was never an important Intercity line. I think maybe they'd wanted it to be one, but it was just a commuter system going up until here and here. Uh, and then maybe there was also Gare d'Invalides, same thing, small commuter terminal. But the intercity trains would go to 6 stations that were not very centrally located, with one exception, which was Saint-Lazare. Saint-Lazare was not centrally located when it was built, but the center of Paris has gravitated in that direction. Rich people lived here, and often city center moves in that direction. This um, happened in London, just not toward the railway. It happened in New York, going toward Midtown, and that did help with the railways. Um, and so, first of all, what does this mean? It means that if you're trying to take the train and your destination is not Paris, you are kind of fucked. Um, this is something that even persists with the TGV network. The TGV has no through running in Paris because the through running that was built in Paris in the 70s and then onward was only for commuter trains. They took either existing lines that went into one of these 6 terminals or lines that went into subsidiary terminals, and they built tunnels beneath city center at very high cost in order to link them and create what was explicitly designed as a regional metro. This was never done intercity. In general, through running, when there's a limited amount of infrastructure and there's through running, usually there will be through running only for local trains. So, in the case of Paris, this means that the most local commuter trains, these are the RER trains, the regional metro. I mean, they don't call it a regional metro anymore, but they did when they were planning it in the 1950s and 60s. And then I believe the name RER is from the 70s. So these are trains that sometimes run express, but generally make more stops than the terminating commuter trains, because the whole point of the regional metro is that it is like a metro line. It's designed to get you to many different places and not just a dot. So Paris, as a city, like for example Berlin, is very not a dot. Now, if you zoom out and think of it as an intercity destination, yeah, it is a dot. Trains just go to Paris. I am not aware of any intercity trains that make 2 stops within Paris. Closest I can think of is that again, there's no through running for the TGVs. There is, however, a bypass around Paris to the east called East Interconnexion Est, and then trains will stop at Euro Disney and the airport. And this is if you're trying to get between, I don't know, Lille and the cities to the south, so Lyon or Marseille. So it's a dedicated Lille to Lyon to Marseille or Lille to Lyon train. And this means that, for example, the frequency will be worse because you can't piggyback on the high frequency of Paris to Lille and Paris to Lyon. So now I did talk about this on video, and then the recording of the video failed, and therefore I ended up writing a blog post called "The Different Traditions of High-Speed Rail." This one. And one of the things that I mentioned is that the French trains, they just don't care about frequency very much. And as a result, that's fine if the trains only run hourly or even less than hourly. But for a regional metro, you can't. You have to run at high frequency. And hourly is not frequency. Think 10 minutes. And so you have to make sure that you're serving all of your different destinations on one train or on a bunch of trains that have transfers. And this is why you essentially end up running like, again, the expression for the RER before it was called RER, regional metro, like a metro system where the city is not a dot. The city is a blob. The dots are within the blob. The dots, that is to say the stations, they are placed at the most important nodes of the urban blob and between them, and of course in various residential areas so that people can access the most important nodes. But but the city itself is not a dot, and so you need to make sure that you have lines within the city. Again, the RER is an urban system. Now, all the lines go into the suburbs. They pretty much all go pretty deep into the suburbs, but the trunks are useful. So I'm not going to do my. So I don't have a good RER map that's an overlay except crayon. So let's go to my trusty, if 5 years old. Not that they've done much change since. Uh, Map of the RER. This is a track map. And you can see how these lines run through. The colored lines, that is, the black lines are the historic, are the commuter lines that are not so, that do not so through on. So there would be, so for example, the line out of Gare de Lyon, the express line uh, is this one. Uh, usually the trains make fewer stops. Not all of them, but usually they make fewer stops. Uh, the TGV used to run on much of it, and now it runs on much less of it. They opened this part. They opened this much better penetration as part of the Interconnexion uh, and these trains end up just terminating on the surface here. The track map does not depict all of the many surface tracks at Gare de Lyon, but they exist. And then the line that's colored green, it doesn't go as far out. Um, Again, there are some trains that skip stops, but the focus is on serving maybe the inner suburbs better, and then the trains just make multiple stops within the city. In this case, Gare de Lyon, Les Halles, which is the old center of the city, and then Gare du Nord. And then they keep going. Um, just this way, just this way on the same train. You don't need to change trains in the middle if you're trying to go somewhere else. So it's easier. It's more efficient. Trains much more quickly go through than they do terminate. Uh, and this is and this green line, the RERD, is not even the most local of the lines. The most local of the lines is the RERA. It's the red one. And what does that one do? The RERA. First of all, these are more inner suburbs. Second, you might be able to tell that there are more red stops here than green stops. So what does this line do? It goes to Nation, Gare de Lyon, Les Halles, Aubert, and Étoile within the city, and essentially it acts as the express version of the Metro Line 1. And then it especially expresses to La Défense, which is not in the city, and then it splits into a bunch of branches. These are not all very high density suburbs. This area is not very dense, but this is essentially a bunch of suburban lines that interline for very good urban frequencies in the core. This is what it is to be an RER, how it's called in France, or in Germany it's called an S-Bahn, and it's the same thing. And I could tell you the exact same story about Berlin, except Berlin has fewer lines than Paris because it is a smaller city, and in Berlin it was done earlier, and this means that that there was also intercity through running, so you don't have the visual starkness of these six separated train stations, because in Berlin, yeah, we used to have that, but then the Throning opened. It's called the Stadtbahn, and it's from the 18. And this is from the 1880s, and so and so a lot of the terminals over the generation since have closed, except for this Leiterbahnhof, which got special intercity through running, so now it's the main train station, Hauptbahnhof. So again, I could tell you the exact same story about Berlin as about Paris. It's just that here, it's less stark on a map that the train stations are disconnected, because now I need to explain to you that before the Stadtbahn opened, this station, now called Ostbahnhof, had no connections to, for example, this station, Charlottenburg. Or again, Hamburger Bahnhof, Lehrter Bahnhof, Nordbahnhof, Anhalter Bahnhof, things like that. So, when am I going to discuss the world's most ridiculous one of them, RB20 in Aachen? Probably not, because I'm talking about this in the context of very large cities and what they should be doing. Yeah, the original terminal. Yes. So for Lehrter Bahnhof, the so a lot of it was accelerated by World War II. So what happened was that, again, Berlin's kind of unique in how much intercity rail through running we have. We have four tracks running north-south through Hauptbahnhof. They opened in the 2000s. The traffic through them would very easily fit in two. They severely overbuilt. Um, and only now are they investing to actually fill them. And even then, they're not investing enough, I don't think. So the way that this worked was they only built the east-west part, the Stadtbahn. Again, this is from the 2000s. And this is not even an S-Bahn tunnel. This is, again, an intercity-only tunnel. They're adding an S, yet another, as I said, they overbuilt. They're still adding another tunnel for the S-Bahn for this. But you might see the S's here. So this is also a through-running tunnel. This opened in the 1930s. This was planned in the 20s, and then they needed money as a depression stimulus program that was provided by Hitler. But as soon as the Nazis entered government, there was already a stimulus planned right before they got into power, and they panicked that they might the unemployment might fall without them in power. So that's when they made the move. They went in power, and then they uh, took credit for other people's programs and then added some of their own. It opened, I believe, I never remember if it opened just before or just after the war started. And at this level, it would be again like the situation in Paris. We Nordbahnhof here. This would have some commuter lines and some intercity lines going, as the name says, due north. And then there were a bunch of stations here. I think Potsdamer Platz and Anhalter Bahnhof were the two stations, and so you can see the kind of different lines. They would either go to suburbs like Wannsee, or they would go to cities to the south, like Leipzig, like Dresden. Um, and so the commuter lines were connected. And again, the point here is connection. These were all designed in the context of train stations that were widely separated and did not have good connections between them. And often this was not even through running. So here, when the Stadtbahn opened, Lehrter Bahnhof went like this, and so did Hamburger Bahnhof. And so there was a terminal here, and then next to the terminal there was the S-Bahn, and then the terminal bits closed. I believe this was after the war because the whole point is that this was West Berlin. West Berlin had controlled access because of the wall, and so all of the access after the war went through here anyway. So all of this got closed. Um, and like was in the east, some of the lines would have gone a little bit through the west. Oh, right, I cannot click. I mean, I can, it just looks ugly. Um, oh, that's the... Oh my god. Why? Really? Why? Why is it like this? Yeah, so through running, as you can see, sometimes looks rather drunk. It does not have to look like nice east-west, north-south, or things like that lines. Uh, what the hell? I'm sorry. I'm so sorry. Now, this is a good example. No, this is a good opportunity, example, to segue into the only American example of through running, which is Philadelphia. So we're through running. Again, it begins in Berlin, for all intents and purposes. Paris adopts it in the 70s. It's when it opens. The plans are from the 50s. And a bunch of and more cities keep doing it. In West Germany, it's because of Berlin and Hamburg that started it. So a bunch of other cities opened their own tunnels, even ones with terminal intercity trains, like Frankfurt. Frankfurt does not have through running even on intercity trains. Frankfurt has a terminal. Trains pinch through it, which you are going to go back to, and it's going to be important that they do rip, rip to go north-south. But Frankfurt does have an S-Bahn tunnel. Same is true of München and Stuttgart. And then more and more cities, inspired usually by these examples, kept doing that. London's Crossrail opened, I think it was mostly, I mean, the plans are from the 1940s, but at least during construction, it was constantly being compared with the RER. Italy has a bunch of these. I think it's a Passanta tunnel in Milan. I'm forgetting if they have another in Rome. In theory, they can, but they built metros instead. In Spain, it's a Cercanías tunnels. So again, something that keeps expanding just because of the inspiration, because it works. In East Asia, this is also very common, and it's often difficult to point where it is happening, just because they just integrated the metro into that. So most of the Tokyo subway is actually through running tunnels. They just run not as express as the RER. They just make metro stop spacing. And the same is true of Seoul. And because of the economic success of Japan and South Korea, that gets exported to parts of the rest of Asia. Unfortunately, not enough. India needs to do a lot more of this than it is. China is vaguely starting, but doesn't run these trains frequently. And unfortunately, in the United States, there's only one example of through running, and that is Philadelphia, which was inspired by Germany. This was pushed for by the now emeritus professor of transportation at Penn, Vukan Vucic. He is a Serbian immigrant, but he is. I put his name immediately. Urban transit. The man has written textbooks on the subject. His students do well in the field. He's very well respected. And wait, what's happening? Oh yeah, okay. Oh God. Anyway, in Philadelphia, the situation was similar to that of pre-1970s Paris or pre-1880s Berlin. Now, not as many stations. This is actually something that the United States used to be far better at than Europe, which was joining stations. So there was something called the Union Station movement. The Union is not named after unions, the railroads hated the unions. It is not named after the Union, that is to say, the United States. It is named as the Union of Multiple Railways. So when a station is called Union Station, it means that several railways were there. Boston, for example, has North Station and South Station, so it's exactly the sort of situation where there should be through running, and a project to do that called the North-South railing has been in development hell for generations. But North Station and South Station themselves are Union stations. South Union Station and North Union Station, there were a bunch of different railroads with a bunch of southern terminals that consolidated their operations into this location, and the same is true on the north. Now, eventually, these railroads also merged. So I believe that. I don't actually remember at this point. I don't remember whether they merged and then built these stations, or built these stations and then merged, where everything on the south except the Boston and Albany merged into the New Haven, and then everything to the north merged into Boston and Maine. But there were plenty of Union stations without such mergers, for example, in Chicago, for example, in Washington. And often these were better rivals, the railways that were building these Union stations. So there were fewer stations to connect. Not the 6 of Paris, or I'm forgetting how many of Berlin, or the 9 of Moscow, which is only starting to do this. I forget how many in London, I want to say 12. Often there would be just 2 or a few more. In Philadelphia, there were 2, and these were again rival railways that did not collaborate, not in the city. They might have built Union stations elsewhere. Um, I do not know. I do not remember the railway history of whether the Reading and the Pennsylvania built Union stations elsewhere. I know that in other cases of rivalry they did, but again, not in the center that is to say New York or Philly. But for example, the main rival to the Pennsylvania for service between New York and Washington, the Baltimore and Ohio and allies, they did in fact build a Union station in Washington after not doing so ever in Philadelphia or Baltimore or New York. Uh, Essentially, all of these failures to build Union stations were to the detriment of railway passengers. One of the most important investment priorities for the Northeast Corridor, in fact, in Baltimore, is fixing the situation caused by the railway tunnels. It took longer to build a tunnel through Baltimore than it did to uh, build the Transcontinental Railway. Um, there was no railway through Baltimore during the Civil War. Baltimore had a lot of white working class that sympathized with the South. Baltimore was heavily connected with the southern plantation economy. Baltimore and New York were the main cities that were exporting slave farmed cotton. So whereas Boston and Philadelphia were very anti-slavery, and the Midwest was incredibly anti-slavery, New York and Baltimore were pro-slavery. So Union troops needed to escort the trains as they were going in streetcar mode through the city. And you might be able to say to you might be able to not to say to see that there are two through lines here. This is because the Pennsylvania and the B&O did not collaborate. So the B&O built this one. It is currently freight only and it's single track, used by the successor of the B&O, CFX. The Pennsylvania built this, and these are both very low quality tunnels. This is two tracks, for example, but the curves are terrible. The water situation is terrible, so there's water intrusion, and the maintenance costs here are very high. So they need to replace these tunnels, or maybe just add tunnels and make these just regional tunnels, like this is the original plan. And anyway, in Philadelphia, there were again two terminals, and they were terminals. So there was the Pennsylvania system, the PRR system, where through service, for example, if you want to go from New York to Washington without changing direction, was provided by this connection, still used by Amtrak on the Northeast Corridor. And then the commuter trains would just enter not north-south, but east-west at 30th Street Station, and then they would terminate here at what is now and what became called Suburban Station because it served only suburban trains. As they were, and this was a tunnel. This was electrified in the 1910s. So a bunch of these are lines that were electrified early in the 1910s. And the competitor in Philadelphia was the Reading. Yeah, exactly. No. I mean, New York City has had some horrific mayors over the time, but yeah, no. But the mayor, but the pro-Confederate mayor has to take the cake is the worst. Uh, yeah. Oh, Reading did use Newark Penn Station. Huh. Okay. Yeah. Yeah. Maryland. I mean, Maryland was also very much the South during slavery. Um, even Maryland was a little weird because Baltimore industrialized like it was in the North, especially after the war. So the racial history in Baltimore is not terribly different from the racial history of, let's say, Philadelphia or Cleveland or Pittsburgh or Detroit. Um, or to be honest, New York. Let's not pretend that the fact that New York is richer and has minorities other than black people, uh, that don't have that history of white flight absolutely did. But especially rural Maryland remained very southern to the point that there was an entire kerfuffle um, when a lot of foreign ambassadors would be driving down between New York for the UN uh, and Washington for their duties as ambassadors to the United States, and over here on the US 30 corridors, nobody would serve them if they were African, and this was creating so many diplomatic problems that JFK was trying to get all the local businesses to treat African dignitaries as dignitaries, to the point that African Americans uh, started dressing up as foreign dignitaries just so that they would actually get service at any of these places. Um, so there wasn't as formal a Jim Crow system in Maryland as in um, the South proper, but there are a lot of southern aspects to Maryland. And my understanding as far of DC especially is that DC is very northern if you're white, but it's southern if you're black. Um, oh yeah, of course, yeah, you mentioned that as well. Yeah, sorry. Um, so at any rate, uh, the rival in Philadelphia for the suburban market was not the B&O. The B&O was based in Baltimore. Maryland, the state of Maryland was trying to side with the B&O against the PRR at several points. It was the Northeast corridor here is actually the second line. So the opposite. So the opposite of the north. I believe that Philly to Baltimore was PRR then, and then the B&O was built around it. Baltimore to Washington, the B&O is the first railway to have been built between the cities, and then the Northeast corridor to build that required the state's permission, and the state would not give permission. So the PRR had to cobble together things that were legally regional railways to be able to do so. By the way, that's still a very high quality line. Baltimore to DC on the PRR can be made a high speed rail, a high speed railway with not a lot of investment. Um, the PRR built a lot of things to high quality. So in Philadelphia, the rival at any rate was not the B&O, it was the Reading. And now I do know that there was some cooperation between them. I think the way it worked for New York to Washington was that it was BMO, not BMO, BNO, then Reading, then maybe Central Railroad of New Jersey. I forgot. Or maybe it went back with the BNO. I forgot. But there was, I think they went somewhere around here. I think this is the remnant of the route that the BNO would take. But Reading Terminal at any rate was here. So very close to suburban because Center City is not very big. And then it would go north to various suburbs. All of this was mostly in-state. Now there is a lot of suburbanization in Jersey. There was early suburbanization in Jersey, in fact, just because it's right across the river. And in fact, until this railway was built, it's called the Connecting Railway, and I think it's 1870s. The intercities from New York mostly did not go to Philadelphia proper, so here. I mean, they did, but people didn't like them very much, so they instead went to railways that went over here, because this was closer to Center City. But the only rail connection that was built, Patco, was built as a separate metro system, not as any kind of commuter rail thrown. Oh, okay, okay. Oh, you mean on the Northeast Corridor? Yeah, south of Philly. Yeah. So there are some annoying curves, especially around Wilmington. So Wilmington to Perryville has a section that needs a not very difficult bypass. But yeah, south of Baltimore, yeah, it's effectively entirely the catenary being bad. Um, oh, okay. The CNJ you think shared with someone else? So at any rate, at any rate, Philadelphia inherits this amazing, many-lined but no-running, almost all electrified system in the 1970s. So based on the German S-Bahn ideal, that was opening in many German cities at the time, West German cities at least. They built this tunnel. So again, tunnel up to suburban is old. Tunnel from suburban to what is now called Market East near the old Reading terminal is new, and then they kept going until here. And then this is old track that was cut off and is now disused. I don't know. I think that there are supposed to be plans to turn it into a linear park like the High Line, or maybe that's been done already. I'm not sure. Um, so this is a through running system, and as with the uh, horrific example that Hulu shared before of the regional line in Aachen, uh, some of these lines look pretty drunk, and the reason they look pretty drunk is that, again, Jersey was never part of the system, unfortunately. So instead of going, so you can't go east-west because east it's Jersey. So the lines mostly would go either west or north. So at best they're L-shaped, and if they are not, then they're sometimes then they sometimes would self-intersect. And I'm gonna try to see if there's a good map. So this was the original plan. Something pretty similar was built. So this was again by Vucic, who gave them numbers R with numbers like S and a number in Germany. And blue here is the Pennsylvania side, and yellow is the Reading side. Okay, don't have a higher degree, a higher resolution version. Okay. Sad. So occasionally there would be wrong side things. So for example, the airport branch might just be new, so it's colored yellow, but it would always enter from the PRR side. Chestnut Hill West, the way it currently works is it goes it goes on the Pennsylvania side, but there are plans to build this Swampoodle connection to let it enter on the Reading side. But either way, lines self-intersect. Look, R7, the historic R7 Trenton would go like this, loop-de-loop, and then go to Chestnut Hill East. And this is, to a large extent, unavoidable with where the Trenton line goes. Essentially, the only way to avoid this is to either say maybe there's more ridership on the Pennsylvania side than the Reading side, and then instead of running through the tunnel, maybe you'd go Trenton to Baltimore, not to Baltimore, Trenton to Wilmington, along the same north-south connection that Amtrak uses, or you just find ways to make the Trenton commuter trains not go like this, but go like this via Camden or something. But this is, again, but the way it is done right now, it is an unavoidable consequence of the current state of the infrastructure, and changing that would be difficult. Now, as I said, there was there was an almost entirely electrified system, and now Pennsylvania has the only all electrified commuter system in the United States, the SEPTA. This was done by abandoning beyond the limits of electrification, and the limits are pretty expansive. I mean, there are so there are a few things farther that probably should have been electrified instead of abandoned, but there's very little. So I think there was the Newtown branch, and maybe two more. But again, nothing that screams build things. Again, they're useful, but if the system is not very useful without them, it's not going to be made very useful with them. So the throning in Pennsylvania, I guess southeast Pennsylvania / Philadelphia, is useful, but let's not turn it into the difference between solar punk and Parable of the Sower. It is not. So why has it not happened? So why has throning, which is viewed as a really important component of the RER, especially in Paris, this really did make a very big difference. or with S-bound systems here. So why did it not make as big of a splash in Philadelphia? How come ridership on SEPTA Regional Rail is basically the same as on the MBTA commuter rail? So that's a city of the same size approximately. And now Boston does have many more, in fact, city center jobs. So to maintain the same ridership is not bad for Philadelphia, but then Boston also maybe has more competition from subway lines going to the suburbs, whereas in Philadelphia the subway is much less suburban, much more contained within the urban parts. So how come a system with no electrification, the Providence line runs diesel under catenary all the way Boston to Providence, 70 kilometers of diesel under catenary, and no through running? Why is Philadelphia not doing much better? And this gets into the other components of good commuter rail. Now, in America, the term for this. Oh, yeah, Newton is okay. Okay, it's Allentown and Reading. Yeah, okay. But these are not commuter lines; these are regional lines. And this is. Oh, okay. So I need to. So because I'm talking a lot about the United States and I have a lot of American readers, I need to explain something. There are three kinds of services that you can run on mainline rail for suburban, let's call it, or metropolitan service, and two words for them: commuter rail and regional rail. The first kind is what is traditional American commuter rail, which focuses on service exclusively to city center, almost exclusively at rush hour. So very little off-peak frequency, often just hourly. The original of which each planned for the for what would be essentially the Philadelphia S-Bahn was to run each line every 10 minutes. So very poor frequency, no integration with urban rail, because commuter rail is not mass transit, it's its own thing, as the late former MBTA general manager Frank De Paula said. Often it's bundled. Remember I talked about the history of white flight. Often it's bundled into kind of ideological white flight in which people. It's maybe a New York thing where people on Long Island they don't quite racialize it openly. This is the North, not the South, but this is what they mean. Essentially, what they're saying is, I'm not paying $12 for a train with a lot of black people on it. So the idea that, for example, the trains should charge subway fare within the city on a one ticket for all, ein Ticket für alles, as they say in Zurich. And so if your public transport ticket is good in buses and subways within the city, it should also be good on commuter rail. A lot of these more racist rider interests complain about that. Now, I don't want to say resist, because resist implies that they have power and they don't. The main reason there's no such fare integration is not that racist riders oppose it. It's that racist managers, and not just racist, but also backward looking, so they don't know or care where the modern world is. And if the managers at the MTA, for example, decided that there shall be fare integration, then it will happen no matter how much opposition there is. Because the Long Islanders, you see, they're not just racist. They don't just hate the city. They don't just hate racial minorities. They also hate everyone who's not Long Island. So this project, it's called Penn Station Access. I'm going to wait for the black lines on Google Earth to appear in their full glory. So you see, Penn Station in Manhattan, going east, the only commuter trains are the ones that go to Long Island. So it's these trains. It goes either here to Port Washington, or most trains continue to Jamaica and then fan out. And you see this bit, this is called the New York Connecting Railroad, distinct for the just pure connecting railroad from Philadelphia. So this line ends up in New Rochelle and then points north, Lake New Haven. No commuter trains currently use it, only Amtrak for intercity trains, so that there can be connections from Boston or New Haven, not just to Grand Central. but to Penn Station. So the way it works is the intercity trains all use Penn Station, not Grand Central, and then the commuter trains to the north use Grand Central. So a project to enable commuter trains to also do this, which mostly means building some bypass tracks, but also building infill stations in the Bronx. This is called Penn Station Access. Andrew Cuomo decided it was a priority for him to build this good project. Unfortunately, it was a good idea. It is being done poorly. For example, again, no fare integration. Now, this is something that I am not going to racialize. Now, the Bronx is very poor, famously very few white people. It's almost entirely black and Hispanic. And the suburbanites do not want to go to school with these people. But this is not the problem for Long Island. The opposition, so Long Island has a lot of opposition to this. Again, this is not racial. This is because the trains would go to Penn Station. So they would share Long Island turf. And people on Long Island, by people, I mostly mean LIRR honchos, like the head of the LIRR at the time, Elena Williams, they opposed Penn Station access because, again, they figured that all these slots in the trains, which were not fully used anyway, belonged to Long Island by right. Then Helena Williams' job was aligned with her skills, by which I mean she was fired, and all of the complaints went silent. So I want to make it very clear. There are a lot of racists who would be against fare integration, but they're paper tigers. So important features of good suburban rail is not to do that. So you need to, so not to have, that is to say, separate urban and suburban trains. And so in Europe, they don't exist. I mean, right now we have the €9 ticket, but without the €9 ticket, still, my €86 monthly in Berlin gets me access to every piece of public transport within the city limits of Berlin. So if I want to ride a bus between 2 points in Berlin, is the €86 monthly valid? Yes. How about a subway train? Valid. Tram? Valid. Commuter train, like the S-Bahn? Valid. Longer range regional train? Also valid. And in theory, I'm not supposed to use it on intercity trains, which are, to be frank, not very useful. But honestly, if I get caught on one of them with such a ticket, I don't think I'm going to get a fine. I'm just going to be told not to do that again, which is fine because they only make 2 stops usually in the city, maybe 3. So, okay, I get off at the next stop. Again, if the train only makes 2 stops in the city, and I'm legally using a ticket that's only for the cities, and then they can't run, then they can't make multiple stops. Right? It's only these 2 stops. And so in Europe, we call this kind of service the very local S-Bahn service, the kind of regional metro that would be how we call it in Paris. We call it commuter rail when we speak English. Or we just say, or if you're familiar with the American confusion, we just call it S-Bahn. And then the trains that are less frequent, that maybe make many fewer urban stops, maybe they don't try to overlie on a shared trunk to run very frequently, and they maybe serve adjacent cities. So they don't go Berlin to suburbs of Berlin or Berlin to Potsdam, which is a suburb of Berlin. They go Berlin all the way to Rostock or Stralsund, or in the other direction to maybe to Cottbus or to Görlitz. So this is Cottbus, this is Görlitz, this is Wittenberg, this is Dessau. All of these have hourly regional trains to Berlin. So we call these kinds of trains regional trains, and these kinds of trains commuter trains. Again, I increasingly just call them S-Bahn. And in the United States, commuter rail means the present paradigm of commuter rail. That is to say, it only runs to city center. There's no attempt to serve other destinations. The stations are typically park and rides, so there's no retail there. I mean, maybe there's going to be a cafe, maybe there's going to be some coffee at the train station, but there's no attempt to make it a retail center, like with a shopping center, or some kind of Main Street type retail. There's no attempt to locate jobs there. There's very little, some, but very little attempt to locate housing there. uh, unless it's single-family houses. Uh, and then there's no attempt to serve urban neighborhoods, no fare integration, uh, no attempt to integrate the schedule with the bus. So you're expected to arrive by car. There's no attempt to, for example, if there are buses, time them to the train. And then right, so ridership is going to be very much 9 to 5 suburban white flighters. That is in America called commuter rail, and then activists use the expression regional rail to mean anything that is not that. So what we would call regional rail and commuter rail is lumped into the American term regional rail. SEPTA regional rail has this name because it was expected to be an S-Bahn, rather than keep the fare segregation from urban modes of transport, keep the very poor frequency, keep the complete lack of infill stops. There's, I think the trains go direct from Market East to North Philadelphia. Maybe there's Temple, actually. They go here, and for example, you might expect there to be a stop over here for the connection with a trolley at GR, but there isn't, because that's not viewed as important. Uh, and now there is a little bit more of an urban stop pattern on some of the lines on the PRR side, but only some of the lines. So again, nothing at GR on the main line. So and it's not because they want the stop spacing to be very wide, because you might notice something, which is that there's this long non-stop segment, and then as soon as we hit city limits, the stop spacing is very narrow. This is so this kind of stop distribution where you have a stop maybe even every mile in suburbia, and then very long non-stop segments. Again, this is because this is intended only for suburban white flighters. Oh, North Philly is not a stop for Market East. That's sorry, I meant North Broad. Yeah, it's Temple, and then North. You're right. North Philadelphia is the PRR station. North Broad is the Reading station. They're very close to each other, but not quite enough for a transfer. So not only is there a loop-de-loop on the older 7, but also it's a loop-de-loop that does not have a transfer. The transfer is very fixable. They just need to move the platforms from this side to this side. They still need to hit Broad for the subway station, but you should absolutely move the platforms in this direction so that people can just do this walk much more easily. So anyway, this is the situation in Philadelphia. So through running clearly did not solve all of the problems. Why? Because many other things remain unfixed. So even though most of the infrastructure for an S-Bahn was built in Philadelphia, the only thing they need is to raise all the platforms, and it's money, but it's not a lot of money. It's a couple of million per station. They haven't done any of the operations for it. So I want to make it very clear. Through-running is good, but it is not panacea. And the reason it's not panacea is that you need to... So through-running is concrete. And you need to make sure that the electronics, the organization, are very good, or else you're just getting a through-running tunnel, and you're still going to get a city that's the size of Berlin. Metro Philadelphia has about 6 million people. It's about the same size as Metro Berlin. And yes, Philly proper is only about 1.6, I think. Berlin proper is, I think, 3.7. Philadelphia does have an unusually weak central business district for how old of a city it is, how dense of a city it is. And yet, all of these things are problems, but that's not an excuse for why there are only about 100 or 120,000 daily riders pre-corona on SEPTA regional rail. Do you know how many ride the S-Bahn in Berlin every day? More than 1 million. In Berlin, just to put things in perspective, the Berlin S-Bahn on the eve of corona had either about the same or slightly more ridership than all American commuter rail systems put together. New York City, the 3 commuter rail systems are about 800. Chicago, 250. Boston, Philly are about 250 combined. The rest, it's all very weak systems. I think then Caltrain, then LA, and there are maybe 100 between them. So we're talking we're talking about something that's like 1.4 maybe total US wide on a weekday. In Berlin, S-Bahn, that's where it was pre-corona roughly. Um, and yeah, exactly. So one of the things you need to do in general is raise the platforms for wheelchair accessibility, for just much better reliability. Having So you can deploy one step from a train and it's relatively reliable, but that's only if the gap between the platform and the train is about 2 steps, which is the situation for about a bunch of our inaccessible stations where there might be a station with, I don't know, 300 millimeter or 400 millimeter platforms, and maybe the train floor is 80 millimeters or something like that, so you can do it in 2 steps. Um, but beyond that, you need to deploy a staircase. Um, Ben, what do you mean 1920s switches? No, we have 1920s switches. America has 1890s switches. Um, uh, but anyway, yeah. So you have all of this, all of these operational problems. So like too many conductors, because for example, when you have trains that are designed around stations, it should be 1.25 meter platforms, and the actual platforms are, I think, 8 inches, so 20 centimeters. That's not 2 steps. That's like 4 steps maybe. And so you need to deploy an entire staircase. So the way it works in America is with trapdoors. The trapdoors, I believe, weigh a ton, and I don't mean metaphorically. I believe the weight of a trapdoor. I believe the trapdoor. I'm forgetting whether it's a ton per vestibule or a ton per car, which would be half a ton per vestibule. Uh, yeah, exactly. And these could be done automatically, but at least in the United States, they are not. So there needs to be a conductor manning each of these. Now, conductors in general should just not exist on commuter rail. Just there should be the trains should all be driver only, and fares should be enforced with random inspections the way they are here. Um, but again, so you have these platform issues, which create all of these problems. They make everything more labor intensive than it needs to be. They're wheelchair inaccessible. And yes, a conductor can assist a passenger in a wheelchair, but what disabled people want is universal design so that they can move about without the need of special assistance. This is really important as a matter of dignity to people with disabilities. There's also the matter that even if all of the people in the wheelchairs have been um, killed by eugenics or something, which a disturbing number of countries attempted, uh, for example, Sweden engages in really brutal eugenics. Uh, not more than 2 people, more than one person. The RER in Paris has these giant trains that have, I think it peaked 2,000 people on them, one worker. Um, so, uh, so even if there are no people in wheelchairs, even then, uh, the even then, boarding when there's a not just no level boarding, but also a large such a large vertical gap that you need to climb all these steps, and it's a very narrow door. It slows down boarding so much that trains have to wait longer at every station. I think minimum 45 seconds to a minute. And at the busier stations, more. Mansfield, the busiest rush hour suburban station in the Boston area, as opposed to, let's say, Providence or Salem, which also got off-peak traffic. So Mansfield is just pure peak suburban ridership to downtown Boston. Um, I think the busiest train of the day there has to schedule a 4-minute stop because, and that's not a matter of accessibility because there is at Mansfield, as at most Boston suburban station, a mini high. That is to say, an accessible piece of platform that is about 1 car or 1.5 cars long, so that people in wheelchair can use the trains. However, there's so many passengers that they need to use all of the available doors, and that's very slow because there's no level boarding. So level boarding is incredibly important. No, there are actually giant length in Paris. The metro trains are small, but the RER trains, the RERA is the equivalent of 9 American cars. It's formed as 10 cars, but it's the cars are slightly smaller, so it's the equivalent length as 9 American cars. The RERB is 8 cars, both in how it's formed and in the American equivalent. Um, and yeah, I believe so. I believe it, or maybe 10 by 22. Um, and again, the RERB is I think 4 by 24, maybe 8 by 24 or something like that. Okay, if it's not 15 plus cars, it's not giant in your book. Okay, but these are okay, but 15 US length cars and is incredibly. I'm trying to think if it ever exists, because in the United States, you occasionally have 12-car trains in New York. Uh, Tokyo is usually 10 cars, but they're formed as 10 cars, but it's the equivalent of 8 American. Some unusual lines, not the ones you're thinking of, are 15 cars, so the equivalent of 12 American. I think Mumbai is the only one with 15 plus car rakes on commuter trains. Um, 15 plus cars, 15 plus US size cars, not a thing on commuter trains. Yeah, I know Tokyo has 15 cars, 15 cars, but it's 15 Japanese. It's 15 Japanese legacy cars, and so these are 20 meters, not 25. The United States is very special, and so is Canada, and the fact that the single level commuter train cars in North America are standardized as 25 meters, which is it's for long distance. Yeah, so this is the standard length for high speed rail, 25 meters, and also for regional bilevels. But in Euroland, EU car is not 27. EU is not 27 at all. EU so an EU car, if it is a high speed rail, then if it is for high speed rail, it's about 25. If it's bi-level, it's about 25. If it's single level non high speed, so for example, the standard for regional trains, it's about 18. For example, the Berlin S-Bahn, a quarter train is 37 because it's 2 cars, so 18 and a half each. So a full length Berlin S-Bahn train is 4 by 37. So I can't do math in my head right now. It is 150. So like 6 American cars. In Munich, uh, Munich is slightly longer trains. I believe their longest. I believe a full length Munich S-Bahn train is about 200 meters, but it's formed as 9 cars. The standard export products, so things like the Flirt, the Coradia, the Mirio, the Talon, things like that, they're formed usually as about 18 meters to a single level car. So again, we do usually have shorter S-Bahn trains, but not always. Again, in Paris, they're the equivalent of 8 or 9 American cars. In Munich, they're the equivalent of 8. And again, no conductors. Conductors do not exist on modern commuter trains because you can always do spot checks. Oh yeah. So it does matter that usually there are articulated bogies, but not always. The Berlin S1 doesn't, and it's still 18 meters. So at any rate, yeah. So throning is one of the things that you need for. Oh yeah. Okay, this is Corail, which are not regional. I mean, I'm trying to I'm trying to not think about legacy French railways because legacy French railways are rather terrible and they're not usually what people think of. These are also bear in mind these are also legacy intercity railways. These are not commuter trains. And yes, having 3 to 4 conductors, sometimes even more. Sometimes there are 6 on the LRR and Metro North. Yeah, that's one of the operational problems. So again, we're talking about. So I don't want to make this just a list of things that you need to do to have to convert what Americans call commuter rail to what we here in Euroland call either commuter rail or regional rail, depending on how far you go. Um, but but yeah, all of these are important operational benefits, or I shouldn't say operational benefits, operational practices. that have benefits. Um, but the importance of through running is specifically something different. And again, you can have it and still kind of suck. Yeah, the fact that the subways have two people in New York is terrible. Also, something really important about labor efficiency. Uh, Last I checked, which was a couple of years ago, the MTA, not just the subway, no, sorry, yes, just the subway, not just the MTA, the subway specifically, was getting about 500, maybe 550 uh, revenue hours a year out of each driver. And in Berlin, I think it's close to about, in Berlin, even including extra board and people so people whose job is sit there, wait for someone to call in sick, it's about 900. And in Helsinki, it's also almost 900. So the issue is that if you have a very peaky schedule, even subway peaky, so trains run every, let's say, 5 minutes peak, 10 minutes off peak, that creates such a scheduling nightmare that uh, you can't have a lot of labor efficiency. And here in Berlin, most subway lines run the exact same service. Not quite all day, not start to close, but from maybe 6 in the morning or 7 in the morning to about 9 or 10 at night. And then yeah, it drops to have service later at night. But that's not the problem is not that you have busier and less busy times. The problem is that you have a double peak. That's not enough for full time work. And the commuter trains here aren't aren't quite flat, and they're also less efficient, but they're flatter than in the United States. Um, and so if you flatten the schedule, which in the case of the New York City subway, it means just boost off-peak frequency, then you would need more drivers, but you would naturally get so much better efficiency that the marginal cost is very low. And this is also true on commuter. Yeah, exactly. Um, yeah, exactly. This is the big problem here. They just gave up essentially and said, okay, yeah, we'll run every 10 minutes or every 12 minutes. Midday, what could possibly go wrong? We're all trad managers. We make our workers go to the office rather than giving them the opportunity to work from home. Why do those people not want to work for us? Why do they all go private sector? It must be because they're all lazy. We work 9 to 5. We drive everywhere. There was this British weirdo, Andy Byford, who insisted on taking the subway to events. What kind of how mad could he possibly be? We're driving everywhere. So people with that kind of mentality figured that, yeah, let's just figure out how to do midday maintenance and not how to do high frequency. But again, I don't want to make it too much about good operational practices. I've written about this, I've vlogged about this. Um, so specifically, what is the value of through running? Um, so again, the issue is that the city is not a dot, the city is a blob, and through running is the most efficient way to serve multiple points on that blob. And I'm going to shift to Europe. Right now, I'm going to show you things on Berlin. Now, bear in mind that European cities like Berlin and Paris have very low kurtosis. Kurtosis is is something called the fourth moment. So it's not, so the first moment of a distribution is the average. Second moment is variance or standard deviation. Third is skewness, which is essentially, is there more mass a little bit to the right or a little bit to the left of the average? And then kurtosis is um, the standard deviation. Does it mostly come from things near or far from the average? So let's see if they have. Okay, all these are kind of useless, to be honest. Okay, this might be better. Um, all of these distributions have mean 0. You kind of see how they're symmetric. The standard deviation is always 1. So in the most platykurtic case, this is the magenta line, it has kurtosis negative 1.2. Lowest possible kurtosis, if anyone cares, is not a continuous distribution. It is a discrete distribution that just has 2 points, like 1 and negative 1. So you have uniform distribution, where what is causing the standard deviation to be 1? It's a bunch of stuff that's not 0, but pretty close to 0. Things around 1 and -1, for example. And then, as we go up the as we go up the legend, we get higher kurtosis. Again, all of these are same standard deviation, which is 1. It's just that the red example or the orange example, the mean is much bigger. The stuff that's not quite the mean but near the mean is much lower, and then the tails are higher. There's so many lines here, and you can't see them very well, but you might note that the cyan line already has the edges of the darker lines above it. So there's more mass around, let's say, number 3 or 2.5 in the leptokurtic distributions than in the somewhat platykurtic cyan one. So I bring all this up because yes, Prague. I'm gonna get to this in a sec. So Berlin and Paris are very low kurtosis cities, by which I mean they have city centers, but there's a lot of I don't want to call it job sprawl, but something like job sprawl into adjacent neighborhoods. So in Berlin, if you work in city center, yeah, I mean, city center is legally Mitte. So yeah, this means you work somewhere here, but it's at this point pretty likely you're working maybe in the second city center, so city west, or in the spillover west of city center here. This is where a lot of the embassies are. Or maybe there's a little bit of spillover in the direction of Gesundbrunnen, so around here. I used to live around here, around the boundary, and here, Bodenviertel, and there are a bunch of prominent mid to high rise buildings here with a lot of jobs. I mean, they're not office towers, but there's office stuff at the bottom. There's a tech space called Unicorn right here. There's a lot of jobs spilling over into Friedrichshain, especially around Warschauer Straße. Amazon is building a high rise right here. And there's stuff spilling over into Kreuzberg to the south. And there's stuff. So technically, the crossing point between Kreuzberg and Mitte was the Allied servicemen crossing Checkpoint Charlie, but central business district functions go to the south of Checkpoint Charlie. Again, on the Kreuzberg side of it. And again, there's stuff here. So city center, in a way, is basically everything within the ring in Berlin. And again, there's more jobs here than I know Prenzlauer Berg, but jobs can go anywhere near. So the blob here has many important dots to be served. Dots like the Trad City Center blobs, so that would be things like Alexanderplatz or Hackische Markt, or the North-South Tunnel. There would be Brandenburger Tor and Potsdamer Platz. I mean, Berlin's not a small city. I don't think of it as especially large because I think of it like in comparison with Paris or New York. But objectively speaking, it's at least a medium-sized city. So yeah, even a small city center would have a bunch of dots in that blob. But then we have more things in that blob, things like Ostbahnhof or Warschauer Straße, or going west, the zoo. So these are pretty important dots in the blob to be served, and things like Gesundbrunnen, Schöneberg, Südkreuz. So throning is how you're serving all of these dots. I mean, yes, you can have a line that serves these and goes up until, I don't know, Potsdamer Platz, and then another line, but if they're disconnected, you can't really get between them. And if they're connected, but then every train turns in the center, can you do that? Yes, you can. You absolutely can. But then, as Prague mentioned, there are issues of equipment utilization. So let's go to New York right now, okay? New York has the infrastructure for throughline. it needs to build some more, mostly because the electrification systems east and west in Penn Station are different, and somehow none of the trains can use all of them. Um, I think the multi-voltage trains that they have can only be changed in the shop or something like that. But again, not big compared with actually digging the tunnels. So Penn Station is a through station. Penn Station is designed and built as a through station. Two tracks to the west. These are the most crowded railway tracks in North America. Uh, Four to the east. This is why they're less crowded. There are four of them and not two. Uh, Two of the four tracks pair very easily with these two. Two of the four tracks do not and kind of lead direct to our rail yard here. So why through run? Why not just do the status quo, have separate administration, separate turfs, just run, just keep the status quo. New Jersey Transit runs into Penn Station from the west, turns, goes back. Long Island Railroad runs into Penn Station from the east, turns to go back. Same station, and maybe only invest in things like high platforms on the New Jersey Transit side, which unfortunately, the Northeast Corridor is thankfully high platform, but the other lines all have a bunch of low platform stations. Um, and invest in maybe more modern rolling stock, electrify the parts that are not electrified, run better operations. Why through run? And yeah, the issue is that is essentially a matter of efficiency. So you see, if I have through running, which I do in my city, or which I did when I lived in Paris, again, regional metro. So what does this mean? It means that the RER, when it is at a major station like Le Halles, like Gare du Nord, um, how long do the doors stay open? Again, this is the very center of the city, and yes, Paris is a low kurtosis city like Berlin, by which I mean, again, dense city center, but the city center is not a dot. Even the very center of the city is a blob. Very much not the situation in American cities where you have a much smaller city center and then next to it, and then as soon as you step out of like a few block radius, it's all single family houses. Um, so in Paris, even though it's a not high kurtosis, American cities are high kurtosis, it's a low kurtosis city. Um, there's a lot of ridership at Gare du Nord here or at Le Halles. Thank you very much, or Gare de Lyon. So what happens? The trains are designed with many doors for fast access and egress. Train gets to the station, opens its doors. Normally, if it's a less busy station, it stays at the station 30 seconds, so only 30 seconds of dwell time. And then at city center would be more like 60 seconds of dwell time. If it's more, it's because there's some kind of cascading failure, which does not just happen. The RER is not the world's most reliable urban rail network. Partly it's because it's very busy, partly it's because France. So at any rate, why do you through run? Because in that situation, train enters the station, clears, that takes a minute, maybe two. Penn Station, yeah, maybe Penn Station would be probably more like 2 minutes because New York, unlike Paris, is a high kurtosis city. The proportion of people in Metro New York who work within a 100 square kilometer block is about 35 or 36%, and it's the same as the proportion in Paris, but in Paris they would kind of fill the entire 100. So the difference between the central 50 and the central 200 is very big. And in New York, it's mostly in the center, so the difference between 50 and 100 is tiny. The difference between 100 and 200 is, I guess you can get the blob to also include Newark. I believe downtown Newark has 30,000 jobs. So just to put things in perspective, the biggest job centers in Metro New York that are not in Manhattan, it's either Long Island City or downtown Brooklyn. On the map is not great for figuring out certain public sector jobs in the city. They are many of them are assigned to Borough Hall, even if they're all over. So it's unclear how many of them are actually there. So there's a near tie between these. It's about, I think, 60,000 jobs each, give or take. Depends on how much you draw these. And this is a metro area of 20-something million people. Manhattan, the Manhattan core is about 2 million jobs. So 2 million this. I think this is maybe 60 or 70,000. And in practice, so is this. Um, so the jobs are much. So the jobs in the center are much more concentrated at the very center. So it's not quite. So again, New York is a large enough city that even in New York, the blob is not a dot. This is why, for the plans for a new tunnel across the Hudson, because as I said, it's two tracks. These two tracks are overloaded. They need two more tracks. They used to be called ARC. This was a terrible project that was canceled by Governor Christie, and now it's being turned into Gateway, which is a different terrible project. What they should be doing in addition is bag all the ideas to build more terminating infrastructure at Penn Station, just continue onward to Grand Central and through Run. Why? Because it's for a bunch of reasons, but one of them is that it's really useful to serve both Penn Station and Grand Central. Because even the peak job density in Midtown is big. It's not serviceable by one station. Yeah, LAC has a terrible Long Island Railroad station, but LAC also has a lot of jobs that are accessed not by the Long Island Railroad. For example, there's the City Tower, this one. I mean, a bunch of subway lines stop at Court Square, and then a bunch of subway lines stop at Queensboro Plaza. So there are actually a lot of jobs here, and there's good transit access from the rest of the city. Don't forget, the LIR is basically useless to city residents. So the fact that the LIR sucks at serving Long Island City and Hunters Point is not actually deadly to Long Island City's role as a job center. And so the issue is you do through running, first of all, because it's useful to have more dots in that blob, or more lines, and then the lines have more dots. It's useful to offer that service to more people so that they don't need to transfer it in city center, because that transfer is just going to be a giant tidal wave of a giant tidal wave of doom, and by doom I mean stampede. It's useful operationally because, again, 2 minutes in and out where you're through running, and you do not do that when you don't through run. So how fast can trains go in and out without through running? In the United States, they think the answer is 10 minutes. In New York, they think the answer is 22 minutes. See my comment from before about realigning Helena Williams' jobs with her skills. In Germany, there are two ways a train can enter a station and then go back. The first is actually going back, and the second is a pinch point. Remember how I said before that I'm going to go back to it when I talked about Frankfurt? Frankfurt being a terminal station. So Frankfurt Hauptbahnhof is a terminal. The S-Bahn does run through, but the regional trains that are not part of the S-Bahn don't, and the Intercity trains do not. And Frankfurt is a really inconvenient location for a terminal. They are planning on some kind of tunnel for through service. Just as they're building in Stuttgart, it's very high cost. Same deal. Stuttgart traditionally it's terminal for intercities and regionals, and then through tunnel for S1, and now they're building a through tunnel. In fact, many through tunnels for regional and intercity trains as well at very high cost. This project is called Stuttgart 21. And Frankfurt is kind of in the middle of the country. I mean, shifted west, but the population of Germany is more west than east. The population density here and here is lower than here. So turns out that there's a lot of trains going north-south that would like to stop at Frankfurt and then go on, and they can't. So what do? Some of them, the fastest ones, just skip Frankfurt. They will stop peripherally, using the airport as a bypass location. Or, much more commonly, they go to Frankfurt Hauptbahnhof. You don't just skip what is probably the third largest metro area in Germany. And then they change direction and go onward, so they pinch. So you might go from Köln to Frankfurt, change direction, and then not go back to Köln, but keep going south. So you change direction briefly, you pinch, and then you go south to and it goes out to Mannheim, and then from Mannheim to wherever. Maybe you're going to Stuttgart, changing direction once more to go to München, or you go up the river from Mannheim to Karlsruhe, and then you're going to end up at Basel. So, um, so when the pinching happens, you want to get in and out as fast as possible because you're delaying all the through passengers, all the ones who are trying to get between, let's say, Köln and Mannheim. So it takes about 4 minutes. It takes 3 to 4 minutes to do that. Uh, um, what are people saying? This was called Alt G for ARC. And even Alt G had some problems. They decided that they needed more rail yards because they didn't think in terms of frequency. Um, but a modified Alt G would be better. Yeah. Um, so exactly. With Paris, you see the problem is if you're trying to build this kind of through service, uh, this should have been done in the 1970s when they were starting to design the TGV system. They were already opening up city center. They should have just made sure there were 2 tracks for intercities. Instead, they did leave tracks for the future, but then in the 90s they put the RERD in there and not um, through surface, which I think was a mistake. At this point, they can't. Like, I mean, it would require to reopen Le Halles, and this is already a very crowded underground. Um, and it's too many demolitions, too much deep mining for this to ever be, I think, viable, which is sad. What they could do is build an underground station around Gare du Nord, uh, make sure that it serves both Gare du Nord and Gare de l'Est, and then build the tunnels to Montparnasse and Gare de Lyon. But that would require redoing the entire paradigm of the TGV, which relies on very low turnover. The trains themselves are not designed for fast boarding and deboarding because the idea is that passengers mostly ride nonstop. One of the ways the turnaround times are so short here, they're, again, at a place like Frankfurt or Leipzig or Stuttgart, it can be 3 or 4 minutes. Is that first of all, the trains are somewhat better designed. I emphasize somewhat, not as well designed as in Japan for fast boarding and ingress. Second, um, there's lots of through ridership. So, um, for the most part, trains from Berlin to Munich don't go through Leipzig. They go through Halle, but some of the trains do Berlin, Leipzig, and then they pinch, and then they go to wherever. Maybe they go to München, maybe they go to Frankfurt. Um, and there's quite a lot of through ridership, so the entire train does not deboard, or does not alight, and so it's just fewer passengers. So that's not going to overwhelm the train's door, so they can do it in 3 or 4 minutes, and then they can reposition drop-in crews. I don't think the driver walks the entire train. I think they get a new driver, and then the driver gets back, and then the driver gets a break, and then gets on the train that goes back or something. And so it can happen very quickly. Now, if the train terminates at a station and then goes back, in theory, the exact same mechanism could apply and could be doing it in 3 to 4 minutes. Trains can usually clear that fast, but usually you want to schedule things so that there's going to be time to clean the trains. There's going to be some recovery time. So you probably don't want to do 3 or 4 minutes. You probably want to do something like 8 minutes. In Boston, they say the minimum is 10. I literally observed 8 at a bunch of places in Germany this weekend. So maybe the train enters the station 4 minutes before the hour, every half hour, and then leaves the station in a major city. Again, major in the German sense. I don't just mean or the regional sense. I don't even just mean Berlin. I mean things like Dessau. I mean things like Stralsund. I mean things like that. And then maybe a bunch of different trains are going to enter the station, let's say 4 minutes before the hour, and then a bunch of trains are going to go on their separate ways 4 minutes after the hour. So that's going to be an hourly knot where passengers can change between trains, and it's going to be a short connection. This is a really important aspect of not commuter rail in the sense of S-Bahn, but of regional rail in the European sense of things that maybe go a little farther and are not as much of a regional metro. And if you're uh, um, and so if you're doing that, then um, maybe the value of throttling is lower because passengers change trains, and maybe you can even do maybe you even have a freebie where maybe you have a complex station throughout at a place like Zurich, which is a terminal and is happy staying a terminal. I mean, I say happy staying terminal. There are two S-Bahn tunnels underneath Zurich, making it the only German-speaking city with two S-Bahn tunnels. Berlin has the Ring and the Stadtbahn, but they're above ground. But for the intercity trains, the intercity trains don't use the tunnels. So it goes like this, and maybe they pinch. Let's say they go to Zurich and then to the airport, or they go to Zurich and then just go back to wherever, St. Gallen, of course, the mountains, Bern, Basel, whatever. But the point is that passengers can change trains very rapidly, and then the value of running is reduced. And often, the very complex throat can be done one way, because a few minutes before the hour, all trains enter. A few minutes after the hour, in the case of Zurich, it would be every half hour, the trains go out. That simplifies operations, and that does make it easier to do to do operations without through running. And you can maybe even push it to every 15 minutes because 4 minutes before the hour, 4 minutes after the hour, so it's maybe 4 minutes after the hour and then 15 minus 4, 11 minutes after the hour. That's enough time usually to get in and out of a complex throat. Even in New York, Grand Central doesn't do it because they have an especially antediluvian operating practice, but Penn Station, 2.5, 3.5 minutes out of Penn Station, you're well in the tunnel. I think 4 minutes out of Penn Station, in each direction, you've already emerged. So the point is that there are things that you can do without throttling, but note that all of these examples I'm giving are about things that maybe have different approaches, and each approach is every 15 minutes or 30. This is not New York. New York specifically has highly branched approaches. You can't time everything to be this because the bottleneck in New York is not Penn Station. The bottleneck is these crossings. So you want to have things go continuously through the crossing, every 2 minutes to 2.5 minutes at rush hour. And so you need to go in and out much faster. And how do you do that? Well, first of all, you are thankful that Penn Station has 21 tracks, which is more than you will ever need if you run through. If you don't run through, the stations can absolutely get in and out fast enough, but it's cramped. So it's possible, but it's cramped. It requires trains to be in and out in about 8 minutes, but there's not a lot of room for error is the problem. And this is the value of throttling in New York again. So it's this operational benefit where you don't need to have as complex operations at Penn Station. It's much easier to throw on. Just generally, metro operations are much simpler than highly branched mainline operations. So you want to kind of metroize your commuter rail system to make it more S-Bahn in another way. In other words. And it's useful for multiple dots on that line, multiple dots within a blob that is the city. And it saves the transfer. These are all important benefits. Again, they're not by themselves the difference between solar park and parable of the sower. If the choice is between that and between getting literally everything else right, you get literally everything else right, so don't do what Philly did. But the thing is, once you get everything else right, throttling just becomes more natural to you. Because part of getting everything else right is just having better operations that can support throttling better. Okay, so you're asking me, okay, yeah, the yard issue is that, yeah, so part of it is, yeah, so there's this frequency issue, which should honestly be fixed, but it's not supposed to be expensive, but first of all, if it's Amtrak, it's expensive, and second, this is not zero infrastructure. But again, it's not a lot. What about a really deep tunnel, Line 9 style? Oh, you mean for Paris? No. And the reason no is that, first of all, several reasons. First of all, Line 9 in Barcelona, which is what you're referencing, is the most expensive subway built in Spain ever on a per kilometer basis by a large margin. I think it's around $200 million a kilometer, which sounds cheap, but Spain usually does this for about 100. Second, the kind of deep boring that they're doing, the whole point of that deep boring is that you're building the station within the bore, and I'm gonna see if I can find this. This is due to a German rail fan and railroader named Anton Dubrow, and it's talking about how it's a good thing and it's inspiring Montreal. Montreal costs are very high, and so this is roughly how the large diameter bore. Sorry, let me see that people can see. Okay, you can see my face doesn't cover this. This is what the line 9 method is. It's called the Barcelona method, or large diameter tunnel boring machine, and there are serious people who believe it should be used more for metro service. There are serious people who have used it successfully to build high-speed rail outside cities. It is inappropriate for high-speed rail in cities. Why? First of all, this is about a 5-meter wide platform. The diameter is 12 meters. So from the center to the very edge is 6. From like this width is not even 5; it's maybe 4, which is fine for a subway. But if you're trying to build a Paris Hauptbahnhof or something like that, forget about it. You need more. Why do you need more when often the existing platforms aren't very wide? Because the existing because you're not going to have a lot of you're not going to have a lot of egress points. The whole point of this is that you just drill a vertical tube at one place. Not even two places, usually just one place, I think, where you drill it right next to this big horizontal tube, and you put elevators in it, and then you connect them. Here, you don't mine very much. You mine a little bit, but very little. In San Jose, they've tried to do much more mining because they do not know how to use this method. The method is also inappropriate for San Jose, but separately, because they did this big cavern for mining, the cost for the San Jose BART subway is at this point more than $1 billion a kilometer, making it. I don't think it's the most expensive outside New York at this point, because I think there's like a little stublet in Singapore and another one in Hong Kong that are more expensive. But the San Jose one is simpler to build, and yet it's about that expensive. And so that's the first thing. And the second thing is usually intercity trains don't just have one platform per track, or rather platform track per approach track. They need a little more. The Shinkansen has a bit more at the major cities because Tokyo is always the terminal. Tokyo does not have running on the Shinkansen. And Osaka was once a terminal, so it has a little bit more. And so usually for intercity trains, it's very major stations. What you do if you're building them anew is you do 2 platform tracks per access track. So this would be what you would do out of 1 access track, and that's fine, but it's more money. So this method, I would really not use it for intercity rail tunnels. I would use it for commuter rail through running in Lower Manhattan, knowing that it's incredibly expensive, especially if you're trying to do fancy stuff like slant access points, so escalators, which absolutely can happen. They do it in St. Peter in St. Petersburg for the metro. You can absolutely do slant shafts for escalators, but this does require more infrastructure. It's just that in Lower Manhattan, where it's just one station, and yeah, you can eat $1 billion on the one station in Lower Manhattan. So this is so anyway, this is why the line 9 method I wouldn't use for such a station in Paris. Again, I would use it for metro for a kind of regional metro where you do one station track per approach track. So for Lower Manhattan, I would not even do this. I would do a fancier version of this, which is called double O face, which is a boring machine that doesn't make you one circle; it makes you two overlapping circles. Um, just so that you can have two lines with cross-platform connections between them. But again, this is the one place where you can spend billion and a half dollars on a train station if everything else is done right. 4 trains per hour, intercity talk could absolutely work, yes, but not but not commuter rail. Um, yeah, I know it was a comment about the TGV, but yeah, the TGV bi-levels are not actually that tall. The problem with them is not that they're tall. The problem with the TGV bi-levels is that they take forever to load and unload. Yeah, so the vertical circulation at Ben is horrific, but where they've actually invested in it, which I think is all but the 4 southernmost of the 21 tracks, there is enough to clear a full train in 2 minutes. Yeah, it's 50 on one side and 60 on another, but every 50 hertz train is also a 60 hertz train. The transformer is the issue is that on AC, higher frequency is a smaller transformer. It's a inverse. It's a perfect inverse ratio. So for example, 25 hertz train in the United States can be trivially reconfigured to run dual voltage 25 or 60. Every 16 and 2/3 hertz train in Germany can be trivially modified to run under 50 in, for example, France. Um, it's the other direction that's harder. So the M8, the one that runs on the New Haven line, uh, only has enough of a transformer for 60. So it can run from New York to Boston, but it cannot run south of New York because the transformer would need to be bigger to run south of New York. They were aware of this issue and they wanted a bigger transformer, but the train is so severely overweight that they had to economize on that. Yeah, the real reasons Notoku are running there are inter-JR crap. JR Central wants all trains on the Kaido Shinkansen to be interchangeable, which means that they all need to have the exact same number of seats. And this doesn't quite work north of Tokyo because of the mini Shinkansen. Yeah, the terminating tracks. I mean, to be honest, none of the trains at tracks at Ben are fun to be on. But yes, you're right. The southernmost tracks, so tracks 1 through 4 on New Jersey Transit. New Jersey Transit having, sorry, Penn Station having 21 tracks. So they're numbered south to north. There are 11 platforms. Essentially, one of the there quote unquote should be 22 tracks, but one of them is missing and is essentially replaced by a wider bit of the platform adjacent to it. I believe the missing track would be between 18 and 19. So that is the wider platform. Uh, so tracks, and New Jersey Transit uses the southernmost tracks. Tracks 1 through 4 don't have the ability to run east of Penn Station, and the highest numbered tracks, I believe 19 to 21, can't run west. Amtrak naturally uses the middle tracks. New Jersey Transit can also use the middle tracks, and the LRR can also use the middle tracks. There's no strict separation of this. There's strict separation of the concourses, strict separation of the vending machines, the ticket vending machines, but the trains don't stop at consistent platforms, or I think they do when they're on time and then they move them around too much and they don't tell the passengers. So over here, when I buy a train ticket, it says Gleis 3 or whatever. It's printed on the ticket what platform number it is because it's consistent. And in the United States, they just don't tell you. JR Central is not that unreasonable, but it is unreasonable, and Kasai is a fucking shithead. Yeah, in general, the idea of L9 style lines is really appealing. The basic problem, it's not the vertical in the slant track, it's that the cost of boring is linear in tunnel diameter, so If you're just gonna bore, then one big bore is the same cost as two small bores. In practice, the building settlement issue is worse than linear, and this means that why would you ever build this? Why would you ever build a large diameter tunnel rather than two small tunnels and then top down cut and cover stations? It's when you can't build cut and cover stations, for example, because you're in a very dense city center with a congested underground. However, in the exact same environment, a large diameter tunnel is going to cause a lot of building substance problems, and this is why they looked into it in Rome, and they decided against using it because of the risk to because of the building risk. So they have to mine the station near the Colosseum at very high for Italy costs and very low for America cost. About middle of the road for, let's say, France cost. So this is it's not exactly so it's not the vertical shaft. The vertical shafts are incredibly easy if you have room for them. For example, a city park. Slant shafts, again, they're harder, but they're not hard. And it's not the setup cost. It's specifically that you're going to have subsidence issues from hell. Oh, Kasai's dead? Huh. I thought that it was. I thought I thought that even like after leaving, Kasai ended up like running the company as it's like some kind of weird Kim Il Sung style necrocracy, where nobody makes changes from what he would have done. Its stream on transit cost would be quite interesting. I mean, yes, I can do it. I mean, the problem is I can always do these, or can blog about them. Uh, oh, and the LRR is between 17 and 18. It's the missing track. All right. Okay, so I do need to be somewhere soon, so I'm going to end the stream now unless anyone has questions. I will try to end around 8:10. Yeah, no, I know it's one of the northern run. I just don't remember if the missing track is the one that should be numbered 18 or the one that should be numbered 19. So that's the one platform that's wide. The others are narrow, but again, oh, how does Subway? What do you mean THRN stack V up? Yeah, no. LIR today is a really good site for this. Oh, subway through running. Oh, you mean the Japanese method of building the subway for through running? Um, it's very good if you can set things up that way. So this is something that's very Tokyo specific, where essentially they didn't have a big subway system when they started doing it. I think they only had two lines, and so they just built the subsequent subway lines as a kind of commuter rail through running. But they also work very well as like an internal subway system. It's something that's good if you're starting from scratch. So I think that a bunch of Indian cities should have done this, and unfortunately they didn't. And Kolkata specifically deserves the merits over the fact that it had. So Kolkata has this beautiful corridor that should be commuter rail through running, and instead, no, not Dhaka. Dhaka, by the way, is basically from scratch, but Dhaka also does not have commuter rail. Basically, like Bangladesh is not India. Bangladesh did not inherit a large legacy rail. Or what? Anyway, Kolkata. Kolkata has two rail terminals, Hara and I think this is Selda. Yeah, Selda. So Hara and Selda. And you can even see how each of them has like something from the north and something from the south. You just build a four track and connect south to north. Uh, so this corridor would be beautiful for that, and instead they're building a standard gauge metro. India has this sulfate problem where they've decided that Indian gauge is bad, degenerate, backward, and worst of all, Indian, and standard gauge is modern, forward, and most importantly, Western, or pretend Japanese. Um, and so and so this is a big problem in India. India needs to do more stuff like this. Unfortunately, it does not. Um, oh, if you mean safety, um, would there be capacity issues along Park? No, because because uh, you're not going to add more traffic in the peak direction. So you might need to so you might need to run trains this way, but you're not adding more trains to this tunnel, the Park Avenue tunnel. So what you're doing with through running is you're taking trains, you're maybe deleting a train that goes from the north to Grand Central, deleting a train that goes from Jersey to Penn Station, and then replacing both with a train that goes from Jersey to Penn Station to Grand Central to Metro North territory and then goes back. So at rush hour in the peak direction, you have the same number of trains. You're going to induce more passengers because it's going to be better service, but peak of peak, it's not going to matter very much. Certainly not from the Metro North area, just because Grand Central is better located than Penn Station. Um, and don't forget, Penn Station access is going to divert some passengers away from Grand Central, especially the ones who want to go to Penn Station. And so it's going to add ridership, but a lot of the additional ridership is going to be off-peak, reverse peak, um, or short. So things like just with better frequency, people going to non-Manhattan destinations. So you're not going to actually create big capacity crunches. And if it's people, and the other trick is that passengers who are using the fall through service. So let's say people who live in Jersey and work in job centers north of the city. So that would be probably something like Greenwich or Stamford. Um, they're not going to participate in the same peak as passengers going to Penn Station, because if they need to be at work at 9 in the morning, then to be at Stanford at 9 in the morning, you're passing Penn at 8 in the morning. And likewise, if you need to be at Newark at 9 in the morning, you're passing Grand Central not at 8, but a little bit earlier than the peak. Um, Park Avenue. Yeah, so the way Park Avenue is, so Park Avenue, so the schedules are like there's always a little change. It's I believe something like 50, right? It's something like I want to say it's 20-ish trains on the New Haven line, 16 Harlan, 14 Hudson, or maybe it's 20, 18, 14. They run 3 and 1 at rush hour, which is a big problem. Essentially, it forces them to use Grand Central as a parking lot for trains. And the and the junction that I'm zooming in on is very difficult as well. This is a flat junction between Hudson and Harlan, but that can be fixed. I mean, it's money, but again, this money, it's real money, but it's not new tunnel money. Does that answer your question? The answer to your question is yes. Yeah, I mean, as I said, yes. Um, yeah, it is crazy, and in both cases, it was, and in both cases for the exact same reason. It's people looking down on the existing legacy system and not caring about compatibility with it, with bad consequences. Are there any other questions? No, Harlem New Haven is. I don't think that's a flat junction. I think Harlem to New Haven is grade separated. No, New Haven and EC. Yeah, no, that one is a terrible shot. Um, Let me see if I can find. I mean, I don't have the track maps in front of me, but let me see. This does not look flat. You see that there's a rail on rail grass up here. This is not flat. Oh, I see what you mean. Yeah. Oh, so there's yeah, you're right. Right, it's flat for fast versus slow. It's not flat for opposing traffic, which is the worst problem. Yeah, thanks for watching, and I will see you again in a week.